Look around. You see the space around you, the screen you're watching this on, your hands, and your body. But here's a question. Can you see your own head? You might respond, well, no, of course not. My eyes are positioned in such a way that they can't perceive the head they sit in, but it still exists. This might seem like a mundane realization, but Douglas Harding saw it as a profound pointer to the impersonal nature of consciousness. I am Isaac Hansen, and this is Simply Being. In this video, we'll explore the works of Douglas Harding, particularly his 1961 book on having no head, and how it relates to non-dual insight. If you enjoy exploring non-duality in a clear, objective way, please consider subscribing to the channel, as it helps the algorithm push my content to more viewers. I want to bring consciousness exploration to a wide audience without any unnecessary mysticism or vague language. Thank you, and let's get into it. Imagine you were born without the five senses. No sight, no sound, no touch, no taste, and no smell. No experience of the external world, no memories of a body. The only remaining experience would be mental events. Now, here's the question. Would you still have a sense of self? Would you still feel that you were an ego at the center of experience, claiming it is yours? Chances are that such a conception couldn't happen under these conditions, and that you would simply experience consciousness as it is, immediate, impersonal, and without any mediation between experience and experiencer. This realization is the heart of non-duality, and points to how consciousness in itself is impersonal. The feeling that you are seeing is a mix of mental events, such as language, for example, I am the one seeing, mental imagery, concepts, and physical sensations. But these thoughts and sensations arise in exactly the same way as the experiences they claim to possess. When you deconstruct the sense of self, its proclaimed appropriative nature loses all sense. It's just another perception. Could the sound of a bird ever own the car passing on the road below it? Of course not. Just as the sense of self, which exists only in thought, could never actually experience the world or own experience. It is simply another experience. Now, a description of selflessness may give you an intellectual understanding, but leave out the experiential evidence of its reality. You might conceptually grasp selflessness, but still feel like a self inside of the head looking out. Douglas Harding's Headless Way offers a simple and experiential method to cut through this illusion, not just as a concept, but as a direct experience. Chapter 1. The Pointing Experiment. Take your index finger and point out at the world. Point out different objects in the space you're in. Maybe you see a window, a tree, or a door. Now point at your knee. See how it too is an object in the field of vision. Now finally, point at the place where other people would see your head. Let the experience rest for a moment. What are you really pointing at? For some people, something might seem to click with this experience. It might become obvious that the direction you're pointing in breaks with how the visual field works. There simply isn't anything in that direction. You're pointing at nothing. For some, this pointer can trigger a shift in experience where the lines between subject, the one seeing, and object, the thing seen, momentarily vanish. You're essentially making your brain glitch. The mind expects to find a head there, but instead, there's just vision. The mind's insistence on being a subject with a defined identity might be evolutionarily advantageous, but is not actually veridical upon close inspection. For others, it might still seem like a mundane realization, And if this is you, then don't worry. Experiencing non-duality may require lots of trial and error, inquiry, and perhaps most importantly, time. If after watching this video, this approach to non-dual insight still doesn't pique your interest, you might want to consider watching a few of my other videos on non-duality. In most inquiry aimed at gaining non-dual insight, one is instructed to become aware of the sense of self, closely inspect the experience, and ultimately see the paradoxical nature of how one experience claims ownership over another. However, this type of inquiry is often clouded with expectation, preconceived notions of what one might find, hope, frustration, and so on. And this is exactly why Douglas Harding's experiment can be so effective. Douglas was infamously known for conducting the experiment on unsuspecting victims at parties or other social gatherings. He would often do this with a sense of humor and playfulness, as a fun way of introducing people to something profound. I think this highlights the strength of the headless approach to non-duality. It's completely stripped of the typical mystic and somewhat dogmatic jargon often used by spiritual guides. It extracts the profound parts of Eastern mysticism and neatly packs it for export in an unassuming experiment. The subjects of the experiment, unaware that this is an attempt at pointing to profound insight about consciousness, might slip right into the core of the practice that so many people spend years trying to reach. The unassuming nature of the experiment is an immense strength compared to the more traditional approaches to non-duality. These approaches often involve meticulous mindfulness and concentration exercises, uncompromising non-duality, which can create a sense of striving where relaxedness is necessary, and contain religious and dogmatic residue. I'm really enthusiastic about bringing non-duality into a modern context. It's the goal of this channel. If you're feeling inspired, you may try this experiment on someone in your life, someone without any experience of exploring consciousness. You might just give them a gift that will transform their view of life. Chapter 2: A Lost Head in the Himalayas. I'd like to read a few of the opening paragraphs of Douglas Harding's book on having no head that I think are particularly beautiful and insightful. I quote, "What actually happened was something absurdly simple and unspectacular. Just for the moment, I stopped thinking. Reason and imagination and all mental chatter died down. For once, words really failed me. I forgot my name, my humanness, my thingness, all that could be called me or mine. Past and future dropped away. It was as if I had been born that instant, brand new, mindless, innocent of all memories. There existed only the now, that present moment, and what was clearly given in it. To look was enough. And what I found was khaki trouser legs terminating downwards in a pair of brown shoes, khaki sleeves terminating sideways in a pair of pink hands, and a khaki shirt iron terminating upwards in absolutely nothing whatever. Certainly not in a head. It took me no time at all to notice that this nothing, this hole where a head should have been, was no ordinary vacancy, no mere nothing. On the contrary, it was very much occupied. It was a vast emptiness, vastly filled, and nothing that found room for everything. Room for grass, trees, shadowy distant hills, and far above them snow peaks, like a row of angular clouds riding the blue sky. I had lost a head and gained a world." End of quote. These are some of the opening paragraphs from the book, where he speaks of his experience of walking in the Himalayas. It's quite a poetic description of the experience one might have from the pointing experiment. He frames it as if this was his first encounter with non-duality. However, one of his famous students, Richard Lang, has actually explained that Douglas' understanding had come years before his trip to the Himalayas, and that this description was mostly a way of provoking curiosity in the reader. But more on Richard Lang later, as he deserves a section of his own. I've always been somewhat perplexed by the insistence of many non-dual commentators to speak of an emptiness which is filled up by the world. In the aforementioned paragraphs, Douglas writes, "It was a vast emptiness, vastly filled, and nothing that found room for everything." In my own experience, there isn't an emptiness to be found. Rather, experience just unfolds exactly as it is. Speaking of an emptiness seems to imply, at least for me, that there is something beyond the mere experience we're having. This seems to subtly imply duality, and ultimately undermine the point he's trying to make. However, when speaking of non-duality, language has a tendency to fail us. Language evolved as a tool for describing the physical world, not for describing the intricacies of consciousness and the ego. And therefore, I think Douglas might be using the word emptiness as a substitute for an experience of non-duality, which is simply beyond words. It's interesting, though, to note that different descriptions might appeal to us differently based on our particular ways of seeing the world, our expectations of the insight, and so on. If something hasn't clicked for you yet, it may well be that you just need to strike luck and have some particular verbal iteration of the insight find you at the right time. The pragmatic value of descriptions like emptiness may make up for the fact that it's not a completely veridical description. Perhaps for some, rather than implying duality, it emphasizes the lack of a fixed self. I take great pleasure in trying to describe non-duality as clearly and objectively as possible, but it really is the case that language fails to really get at it. It's as if any attempt to describe subtly and unintentionally evokes tinges and nuances of duality. Chapter 3: Me and My Many Layers. One fascinating part of On Having No Head is Douglas Harding's description of the many layers of a human being. When looking at a person from across the room, he saw an ordinary human figure. However, upon getting closer, the figure became just an upper body, then a face. If we had a microscope, we might discover cells, atoms, and ultimately nothing at all. Conversely, if we zoom out, that same person becomes a part of a building, then a city, then the world, then a galaxy, and finally the universe itself. Where exactly is the person in all of this? Where is their true essence? Where is the so-called I? The answer might be that such an essence doesn't exist, at least not in the way we assume. Everything is dependent on everything else, and each distinction we make is just a categorization useful for human survival, but ultimately unrepresentative of reality. The entire universe is an interconnected web of relationships where nothing exists in isolation. Take Earth's ecosystem as an example. Small disruptions in seemingly insignificant components can cause massive ripple effects. Without bees, pollination would be disrupted. Without pollination, many crops wouldn't grow. Without those crops, humans and other animals would struggle to find food. Without sunlight, plants wouldn't be able to grow in the first place. And without the physical laws of the universe, the sun itself wouldn't exist. Everything is interdependent. Now, compare this to your own body. Removing any vital organ would be catastrophic, yet you are not any one of these parts. Perhaps the brain claims ownership over the rest. After all, we don't say I am a body, but rather I have a body. But is this central I anything more than a thought? If you look closely, where exactly are you in all of this? This is what Douglas Harding invites us to explore by adopting an almost childlike curiosity about reality. The sense of being a separate ego exists entirely in thought. It is not the experiencer of consciousness, not a fixed entity located in the head, and certainly not the vital center of experience that it claims to be. Chapter 4: The Headless Way Today. I mentioned Richard Lang earlier in the video. Richard is one of the best proponents of the Headless Way in present day. He was a close friend and studied consciousness with Douglas. I find that he has one of the most soothing voices I've ever heard. He's a wonderful mix of my grandfather and Santa Claus, and his mere voice can bring calmness even in the most stressful moments. If you're interested in learning more about the Headless Way, or just want to hear this voice for yourself, I would strongly recommend seeking out Richard's material. I particularly enjoyed his appearance on Sam Harris' podcast Making Sense, which was where I first heard of him. I'll leave links for Richard's content in the description of this video. The Headless Way is a simple, direct, and experiential way of approaching non-duality. Its strength lies in its unassuming and playful nature. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and perhaps sharing it with someone you think could find value in it. This has been Isaac Hansen with Simply Being. Until next time.